Several days ago, there was a terrorist attack in the heart of Paris. Two gunmen walked into a French satirical newspaper and killed 12 people. One policeman who was guarding the editor-in-chief, the owner of the newspaper, and then a policeman who was nearby, as well as 10 editors, journalists, guests, etc. that were present at the location. So a decent number of people killed there by the two gunmen. Also, a policewoman killed in a related incident by a third guy who said he acted together with the two brothers, though he claimed affiliation with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, whereas the two brothers claimed affiliation with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. For about a day afterwards, they went into hiding, and the French police, the French army, their counter-terrorist forces went on a massive manhunt to find these guys. And they managed to get the two brothers held up in a printing press near the Charles de Gaulle airport, pretty close to the airport, one of the biggest airports in fucking France, I might add, and that affected operations. And the third guy took about 20 hostages in a supermarket, killed 4 of them when he took the market over, and threatened to kill the rest if anything happened to the two brothers. These guys were working together, despite their differing allegiances. They were all killed. No hostage was killed or injured when the police took them out, thankfully, and they're all dead. With the exception of the partner of the terrorist who took the people hostage in the market. She escaped through Turkey to Syria, as far as we know, as far as Turkish authorities are concerned. And they're also saying that she escaped on the 2nd of January, which would mean she escaped before the attacks took place and probably was involved in some way in the planning of the attacks. There's also fears in Europe and France, across the world, really Western world, that there might be more terrorist attacks coming. Well, this is what happens when something like the Islamic State is created. You've got lone wolf attacks put at risk in Europe. There's always that risk. And in fact, counter-terrorism organizations across Europe have been working very hard to prevent something like this from happening in the first place. They're not perfect. You can't prevent all attacks, but what you can do is reduce the likelihood of them happening. And considering how many people, how many Muslims have gone from Europe to fight for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and how many have come back, to just have one attack ever since that whole mess happened means that in large part it is working. And now they're gonna get the measures they're gonna take in the near future because of this attack, well, means that it's unlikely that we'll see a new attack for some time. Though, as long as the Islamic State exists, as long as Al-Qaeda exists, there's still always that risk. That's something people need to be aware of. So why did this happen? The way I see it personally, and this is just purely speculation on my part, is that Al-Qaeda is trying to stay relevant in this day and age. Believe it or not, Al-Qaeda has received a lot of criticism, even by extremist Sunnis who form the core of their follower base, because of how successful the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria has been. They've taken large chunks of territory. They've taken Raqqa, they've taken Mosul, they've taken towns, villages, smaller cities. I wouldn't consider them cities necessarily, but that's what they're called. And they have a large chunk of territory, and they're fighting pretty much everyone in the region and holding their ground reasonably well. In some cases, they're even winning. In other cases, they're losing. It depends on what theater of war you're talking about. And Al-Qaeda wants to show the world that it still matters in this day and age, because they are not allies with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In fact, they're opposed. The Islamic State was part of Al-Qaeda, but then they split off because Al-Qaeda didn't want them to be involved in Syria. They wanted al-Nusra to be their organization in Syria, and the Islamic State took advantage of the situation in Syria and moved in Syria, took over large chunks of territory, weapons, recruited a bunch of fighters, and then moved on Iraq, took over Mosul. That's how it happened. So I see it as a way for Al-Qaeda to try and stay relevant. But there's other factors as well here. Islamic extremism, Islamic terrorism is something that exists. Despite so many people in the liberal media, so many world leaders trying to play that down because they're afraid of tensions between Muslims and non-Muslims that are rising regardless, because they have no plan to fight this. They just make neutral statements and think that's it, that will calm tensions down. It won't. It simply won't. You have to accept the fact there is Islamic terrorism and there is Islamic extremism, and there's a sect in Sunni Islam which is what's breeding these people, as well as other things. These people come from countries which for a long time have been badly led, and they come in Europe, and it's a whole different culture, and they're not assimilated culturally. They might learn the language, but that doesn't mean you're assimilated. That doesn't mean you're handling culture very well. And they're looking at what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Iraq, and the stance of the West with regards to certain leaders in the Islamic world, and they see the hypocrisy of the West, like the West is supporting Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian government, which is quite reprehensible in terms of its human rights record, and they're not willing to go to war with Assad because, well, Russia and various other things, but they're perfectly willing to kill Sunnis and help Assad essentially by fighting the Islamic State. That's how Sunnis see it. That doesn't mean I agree with that mentality at all. I fundamentally disagree, but you need to understand where this whole thing is coming from. It hasn't helped either that the West invaded both Libya and Iraq. As bad as Saddam was, he kept the people of Iraq in check. There was a government of Iraq, not a very good one, but it kept things in check. It kept the Sunnis in check, the Shias, etc., etc. And removing that government, and the way the West did it, with no plan, with terrible political actions once Iraq was taken over, with well, let's just say it was very badly done. If people have followed the Iraqi war, the way that invasion was conducted, the way the government was built following the invasion, there was a lot of idiotic moves. More specifically, following the takeover of Iraq, a lot of people that were part of the Ba'ath Party were unable to get jobs because the U.S. occupation government didn't want them to. They wanted to remove all these people from their jobs. The problem with that mentality is that a lot of these people didn't care about Saddam, and in point of fact had been forced to join the Ba'ath Party in order to have any position in society. That doesn't mean they were politically active, that they cared about it, that they hate America. But by removing them from their jobs and preventing them from gaining jobs, they created the Iraqi insurgency. And the US realized this far too late and did eventually allow people who had been part of the Ba'ath Party but had not been politically active to get jobs, but it was far too late. In Libya, Gaddafi had successfully managed the delicate tribal relations in his country quite well, and Libya was the most developed rich country in Africa. That's not saying much, I know, but you need to understand that for all the things Gaddafi did bad, he did a lot of things right. He built infrastructure, roads, industry even for his country. He developed his country, and he managed the various political squabbling in his country very well. When he was removed through a rebellion, through a civil war that was backed by NATO, but that was backed by West, and the rebels took control over the country, chaos reigned, and still reigns. There's been two Libyan civil wars since the one in 2011. And this all feeds into the Islamic extremism, because the people from these countries who become Islamic extremists are people who have seen their countries disintegrated, they've seen their countries being badly led, they've seen the West not give a fuck, and they're pretty angry at the West. They're also pretty angry at their governments as well, and they want to take both of them on. They want to send a message to the world. And that's what you get when you have incompetent policy making in both Libya and Iraq. And you've got incompetent policy making across the Middle East. You've got idiotic leadership in terms of Egypt. You've got poor leadership in the case of Syria, and the way the West handled Syria, and actually how everyone handled Syria. Creating the Syrian rebellion, which is what Turkey did by allowing so many people to move through its territory or organizing its territory like they did the Free Syrian Army to fight Assad, is what destabilized Syria, what allowed the Islamic State al-Nusra to get so powerful as they are right now. And we've got the shitstorm that's growing stronger and stronger every year as this continues. So we've got the terrible situation across the Middle East, and people become extremists, they get desperate, they're drawn to these terrorist groups who make them various promises, who are able to manipulate them successfully, and they go on mass shootings for them. This was a professional attack, by the way, what happened. These guys were not amateurs. They knew exactly what they were doing and how to get away for a time, because they did manage to stay hidden for about a day until they turned up. And in fact, there were fears that they might even escape. But apparently, well, the police does catch up to you. Good. The rats have been put down. But there are concerns for the future, and we will see what happens. Personal stance on this: at the end of the day, the West needs better policymakers with regards to the Middle East, and the West also needs better policymakers in terms of how we deal with all the immigrants that come to Europe, because our governments are completely incompetent in terms of dealing with immigrants properly. We should assimilate it. It's not about religion, it's not about Islam, but it's about them respecting the countries that they're in, respecting the laws, the rules, the regulations, the social expectations of the countries they're living in. And we just see incompetent governments, incompetent government after incompetent government taking power, not handling the situation. You see tensions rising. No one does anything about it, except the people saying, oh, we should all live together. That's not the solution. That's not really not the solution. Something's got to give, and something will give. And well, basically these guys got exactly what they wanted. They put Al-Qaeda back on the radar of everyone, reminded the world Al-Qaeda is still something as an organization, and also increased tensions between Muslims and non-Muslims, which is also something that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State want. Make no mistake, both these organizations, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, want heightened tensions between Muslims and non-Muslims. They want Muslims to be hated in their countries, because that will push them to join their organizations. On top of everything else that I've said, this is one of the main reasons that such attacks are occurring. They want the hatred. They want the infighting. And that's something that needs to be dealt with in an effective way. And it's not being dealt with.